What?
Okay. Here we are, sort of. Okay. Let's see if we, yes, everything else is working. Good. Okay. Welcome. Wednesday office hours. Sorry to be a little late. It's more the usual trying to log into the live stream. Getting past security. So, aside from it being a terrible day, poor woman lost her life this morning.
I think you mean a domestic terrorist. Domestic terrorist.
Oh, yes, a domestic terrorist, mother of two, a white
Yeah.
woman,
Yeah.
even.
In a Honda Pilot, which is a well-known terrorist vehicle.
Exactly. These motherfuckers. And the whole thing's on tape, so it's
Yeah.
all recorded. It's just, it's George Floyd the second, and it's only a couple of blocks from where George Floyd was killed. So it's even worse now. It wasn't even a person of color, not even Somali, whatever. Motherfuckers. Anyway, excuse me. So, technofeudalism, techno-fascism, sort of what's going on in the current state of affairs. I offer up an article and a couple of definitions. Technofeudalism, one way in which we could define it would be a new form of political economy resembling historical feudalism, characterized by social justice and the dominance of user administrators in online communities. Hopefully, you can get the sense that historical feudalism, is about who owns the land, who works on the land, who's sanctioned or warranted, who's allowed to work on the land, and for what kinds of sort of exchange, how is value produced, who gets some of it, and ultimately this is and in many senses it's the precursor to pre-capitalist in that sense. And unless you think that's not an area, actually there's a whole area of pre-capitalist sort of economic discussion. So that's it, and that's just in the historical feudalism sense. In the modern sense, we have people like Yanis Varoufakis talking about how there's some sort of regression or return to a kind of feudalism because the cloud becomes the new manor, I suppose, a manorial estate or whatever. And so we're sort of, and the people who mediate that is, there's vassals and then there's serfs, and of course there's the lord of the manor, and the vassals, our modern bureaucracy, perhaps, or our access to the cloud, controlled as it is, in fact, by servers ultimately. And who runs those servers, who owns those servers, not necessarily identical, and it's managerial. And so in that sense, you can structurally argue for a kind of neo-feudalism. And whether that's useful or not in terms of analysis is unclear to me, and I think unclear to a lot of people. And so that's kind of why I pursued this. It's a very recent article It came out this summer, I think. And it's written by Kohei Saito, who, on the one hand, is sort of the darling of Japanese Marxist philosophy, I suppose, popularizing the term, at least from a English understood in Japan point of view, as the, sort of moving from the Anthropocene to the Capitalocene, which I don't know if that gets us anywhere either. And so I tend not to use it because it's not a kind of daily discourse thing. But it is something that one should be aware of, because it describes the fact that, as Marx says, this is capital. Capital is at work, and our labor is, translated versions of it, is transformed versions of it. And it is the terms under which that transformation occurs, that translation occurs, that we get exploited. We take advantage. We make money. We own refineries. We hire up Russian hulls, to transport our sour crude or whatever. Anyway, capital's at work one way or the other. And so I put in this little tag here about a blog post about the Web 2.0 conference in 2004, and Mark Andreessen, another one of those tech bro types, apparently said this on a panel. They're APIs, and they let you do certain things, but it's all very carefully controlled and sort of a plantation owner sharecropper kind of relationship, which is exactly the point of talking about technofeudalism, is that plantation owner sharecroppers relation, the sharecropper relation, is one that exists past the Civil War. And so it's not, on the one hand, slaves could get freed. We could end the slave mode of production and achieve feudalism, which is kind of what occurs in the South. And unless you think that's unimportant, the South for, probably all during Jim Crow. Jim Crow helps to make it function as a feudal system. I mean, it is, and things result from that. More people die. People of color die. They have low education rates. They have higher poverty rates. And yes, the lynching occurred, far too long in the future. So anyway, the point is technofascism as a kind of result of feudalism, and you could say that the feudalism, regardless of whether it's techno or not, is a set of power relations between an asymmetric set of power relations that is focused on elites or individuals who authoritarians. I mean, that's kind of what we could argue today, is that, ICE goes into Minneapolis, they assume that they're just doing the a manorial business of the God Emperor Trump. And so, they can do whatever they want, since they seem to have been given a license to now kill people. They certainly have had the license to grab people, to abduct people, with a little attention paid to what, politely speaking, as occurred after the Enlightenment. We have a liberal democracy. We're supposed to be in one, and so you respect the rights of individuals. Well, unfortunately, the sheriff of Nottingham has come in and it's decided to abduct people for doing something, whatever that is, getting in the obstructing fascist justice. They're trying to grab people who are not citizens. And as we've seen today, who cares if actual citizens and citizens of the dominant racial category get in the way? They just happen to, they're whatever. Fellow travelers of the Somalis, which is not true. And, it's just stupid. And it's interesting to see, if you look at Twitter, no one should look at Twitter. There's, that sort of stuff. There's a lot of disinformation and misinformation being thrown out there They claim, well, she's not from Minneapolis. She's a professional protester, blah, blah, blah. And there's all that kind of stupidity that is easily grown on social media. So, technofascism refers to a political ideology that combines elements of fascism with advanced technology, often emphasizing authoritarian control and the use of technology to maintain power. It critiques how powerful tech figures may exploit technology to undermine democratic systems and promote oppressive regimes, kind of where we are right now. And so the article, I'm going to get there, I introduced this particular little map, which is more fascinating now because it's a 1940 map by a group of folks who believed in kind of what the tech bros believe now, and that is that America should become a kind of techno culture, techno nation with, and in a libertarian sense, there shouldn't be state borders. It's just one big thing, and we're all members of the thing. And, we should let technology solve a lot of problems and blah, blah, blah. And what's more interesting, of course, is that they designate Canada, Greenland, and all the way down to, yes, Venezuela is in the 1940s described as this technate, right? This is before Castro, before, a whole bunch of other things. And so it's interesting to see this image, this idea. And technocracy is not a bad thing in the sense that in the 1930s, people, who begin to think of these kind of collective ideas, some of which are driven by authoritarians in the Nazi case, but they have this sort of idea about the modern, faith in technology, et cetera, and that this is just one example of that. It is unfortunate, though, that from a technocracy point of view, tech bros are actually looking at pretty much the same thing. And this map describes the kind of resource provisions that would support a single entity called the Technate of America. And yes, people have actually mentioned this to Trump. So he may have actually, had this in his little brain somehow. Certainly some of his followers have. Now, there are two tables, or there are several tables, but what we're talking about, what Saito is talking about in this is forms of cap. I've already done the whole article on tape and yammered about this, although I doing it in slightly greater detail now. There are forms of capitalism, frontiers of accumulation. This frontier is not unlike the subsumption stuff we've been looking at, the difference between boundaries and bounded and contiguity and separation, et cetera. There's a frontier of accumulation, and let's just think that's unimportant. Mass production of electronics, is probably the height, the apex of the acme of modern industrial capitalism. That is, you have an entire consumer society that is organized in useful and interesting ways. We have we have rural electrification. We have the ability to have electricity, you plug it in the wall and the stuff works. And we still do a lot of that. I mean, now our cars are kind of like that, an extension of that, electric vehicle or hybrids or whatever. And so it's all still industrial. There is unevenness. Not everyone has an electric vehicle. And there are idiots who, say, well, that's, the elite can afford that. You should be still driving with fossil fuel because we'll make more money. Those of us who have, our hooks into fossil fuel will make more money, blah, blah, blah. So that's the current state. Now, commercial capitalism describes, the period from 1970 to 1990. And note that this is an important period. This is the same thing where you get an awareness that resources of a certain type are scarce. That is, OPEC decides to leverage, their feudal relations to the energy market and screw with the United States. It doesn't affect everyone. I know that at least for a couple of days, and I didn't drive as much, I had to sort of wait in line for gas, but fortunately mass transit existed where I was, so it really wasn't a big deal. But we haven't gotten there again for a long time, but we know that the same kind of rationing certainly does exist in a lot of places, especially when this is getting cut back. The Russians are experiencing it sort of piecemeal. So commercial capitalism is 1970 to 90, branding and marketing. I mean, branding and marketing existed obviously before then. Branding and marketing exists all the way back to the actual feudal period. The first marketing of things with packaging and wrapping, goes back to what, the 16th or 17th century. I mean, but not in a wide scale sense of, you have a middle class that purchases stuff and blah, blah, blah. That's more the 19th and 20th century, but commercial capitalism is all about that as well. And then there are some people who still indulge that and who believe that they are the king of branding and marketing, like certain people in the White House. So commercial capital is all about, that's what it's about. Now, 1990 to 2010 is, and it's not perfect, but you know that neoliberalism begins kind of with sort of the end of the Bush era and the beginning of the Clinton era, and you see some major changes in terms of neoliberalism, deregulation, all kinds of stuff. And financialization becomes the important element of this. In other words, more abstract elements of the economy are being, manipulated, as it were. And we see the opening and the failure, of course, of financialization because it does engage with interest-bearing capital. And the manipulation of this interest is still with us today. Certain idiots think that, well, if we lower, if we get the Fed to lower interest rates a certain number of basis points, money will become more available and the market will free up everything. But that just isn't how it works. Some idiots think that that's how it works, but it doesn't quite work that way. And it's much more problematized, especially since the so-called Great Recession. And so we didn't describe here anything that happened before, like the Great Depression, which hopefully none of us will see in our lifetimes, but it could still happen. What might precede that? And this is the Marxian question of whether you get those kind of crises, catastrophes, whether you do get something that makes a full collapse and everything falls apart. Now, everything could still fall apart, but it doesn't appear so because they've worked out ways in order to sort of keep things going. That's kind of why we're in stagflation now, where there's a certain stagnation in certain sectors, and you can maintain a kind of inflationary thing if you can convince people that no, the prices aren't high. Yeah, you're mistaken. These are not the droids you're looking for. But that's just false because people know. You walk into the supermarket and your prices are higher, and you definitely know when you actually try to buy capital goods. Anyway, rentier capitalism is how things are described since then, since the Great Recession or whatever, at least in an American context. I mean, it was obviously not quite as bad elsewhere on the planet, but the point of sort of American, European, et cetera, relations is it's rentier capitalism much more powerful. And of course, you can see the current fracture, as we've seen. Certain stooges of certain other people are trying to break up NATO and blah, blah, blah. All of that is part of trying to confound rentier capitalism. And hence it will have a kind of, not a trickle-down effect, but there will be a chaotic effect across the global economy. And certain elements are just not going to do it. I mean, seizing Greenland is just, well, people should be able to see that Trump is doing Putin's work for him, and it's not xenophobic or Russophobic or whatever. It's just that there happen to be some folks out there who are going to get a major advantage if Trump essentially surrenders the power of international alliances, because once it's fractured and you have only three sort of major powers, America is losing its its position as a major power, and in fact, this emphasis on seizing other people's oil is trying to make us more like Saudi Arabia than America, which is even more confounding because that's just it's sort of the point from a hegemonic point of view that you don't try to level yourself off with one's quote unquote lessers because you're the superpower. I mean, why are we doing that? Why, under what reason would you sabotage your own country? Well, anyway, rentier capital is the key element of that. See, it took me a long time to just get to the front of the article. You can read the article for yourself. The article is Rentier Capitalism, Technofascism, and the Destruction of the Common. And the title hopefully reveals all of this, that certain things that are common, that are collective, or that are the common good, the commons, are part of some of the issues that are currently at work, right? The oceans, the seas are a common. They're not really owned by anybody, but that doesn't give you the right to go blow up people or seize ships and crap like that. We do actually, there should actually be rules, but some people want to confound the rules because it works to their advantage, and et cetera, and they would love, as some people have tried to do, is to bring us back to the 18th and 19th century, which is, I mean, I guess we'll get back there, if you nuke the planet, but why should we have to relive that entire period? But some people fetishize that because it obviously, if you have more power, if you have your own pirate ship, I suppose that's an advantage. It's not really an advantage. Pirates really didn't have as good a time as you might think, and they still don't. Anyway, authors are Kohei Saito, as I said, of the Capitalocene, et cetera, et cetera. It's not his term. The Capitalocene actually goes to some other authors. But Saito kind of gets in there to try and state the difference between the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene as sort of overlapping but distinct geologic kind of movements, where Anthropocene describes the intervention of, or the influence or effect of humans on the planet. The Capitalocene is another sort of meta thing that looking at humans was important. Obviously, they have effects, et cetera, but capital is actually much more important because you can see, as if you just sort of follow through on the rentier business, that capital is what is doing all of this, and it's not a Marx thing. It just, capital is operating. You can see it. You experience it, in your daily life. It's just, we're up to the point where, you can't use cash to do things anymore, which, that may seem more communist in that sense, because, we don't need to carry stuff around with us. And so that seems more modern. Well, on the other hand, it also means that other people have power over your right to have these, things, credit, debit, deposits, whatever. And that can be manipulated. I mean, anyway, a specter is haunting the world, the specter of feudalism. This statement may sound old, given the prevailing optimism surrounding digital technologies. Indeed, mainstream discourses continue to celebrate the future of capitalism driven by full automation, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. Yet, a gloomier vision is increasingly taking hold. In the context of prolonged stagnation in high-income capitalist economies and rising economic inequality, some critics now bluntly contend that capitalism is already dead. Well, they've been saying that for a while, and I wouldn't go, believing Mackenzie Wark anyway on a lot of things. Although I appreciate her writing, I just don't, quite agree with it. But anyway, according to this perspective, however, it is not the workers of the world who have dismantled capitalism, but capital itself, which is the achievement that Marx would actually agree with. That capital is this, self-limiting or self-destroying character. In this narrative, though, capitalism is superseded by a revived form of feudalism. This is the, Varoufakis position, so-called technofeudalism. tech oligarchs, now referred to as cloudalists. Well, it's the same thing as the feudal stuff, right? There's the lord of the manor, there are vassals and there's us who are pretty much serfs next to tech bros, who I would assume are vassals in that particular sense. But there are certain, of course, tech bros who own everything, and that's like Musk, Bezos, etc., are portrayed as the new ruling class of the digital platform economy, extracting data and rent from all of us. And yes, that is what's going on. It is what's going on. Hopefully, you just appreciate that this is what's going on. That reframing it, redefining it, whatever, that's fine. It's just that I think that its material reality confronts everyone. The concept of technofeudalism is certainly provocative. The specter of feudalism haunting the digital age is a curious amalgamation of reality and metaphor. And it is an amalgamation, but the relations are similar, structurally similar. Reframing it doesn't really help you any. It just simply shows power relations, asymmetry, discrepancies, and everyone's just trying to get along. The advocates of digital age neo-feudalism often assert that capitalism has been killed. That's metaphorically interesting and useful, and you can write lots of books on it, but capitalism has been killed several times and still hasn't died. So, and some even claim that this isn't just a metaphor. Now, Jody Dean, as a communist, is probably correct from her point of view, but it's not automated luxury communism. It's just not that. And in fact, when you start arguing it, you get kind of lost in the metaphors. But anyway, yet these same commentators frequently concede that their usages of feudal terminology are indeed analogies, which doesn't get you anywhere, or that it reflects only an emergent tendency, which is the weasel word you can always get out of things by saying, oh, it's only a tendency, it's a trend, it's blah, blah, blah. And that's fine too. It's just that one should understand what the limits of language are in this context. In truth, this is Saito and Suzuki. Well, anyway, in truth, it's difficult to deny that the global economy remains fundamentally capitalist. The mode of production is capitalist. I mean, you need capital, it creates currency, people work for wages, blah, blah, blah. All that's there. It's a capitalist economy. And yes, of course, there are feudal relations within this. There's informal economies, there's barter, all that shit occurs as well. And it's uneven. But the mode of production, as Marx would describe it relative to historical materialism and blah, 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 it's capitalist. It's not socialist. They're little regional socialist styled economies, but they're usually mixed economies because they usually have to interact with the world, and the world is capitalist. So therefore, money still, currency occurs and blah, blah, blah. As such, the concept of technofeudalism quickly reveals itself to be ambivalent and analytically limited in its capacity to explain the dynamics of the contemporary digital economy. So this is the point, is that, it's a thing that sells books, right? We all are members, we're digital workers of one kind or another, some of us more so than others of us are just idiots. But there's a digital economy, and we're trying to get a handle on it. Some people have gotten a handle on it and making lots of money or ripping off lots of people, which is not exactly the same thing. And, we're still trying to work through that, as I pointed out yesterday in a thing, that, in 4 or 5 years ago, no, 6 or 7 years ago, Maduro wanted to move to Maduro of Venezuela wanted to move towards some sort of digital crypto economy leveraging Venezuelan oil. It's a crypto. But it's hard to see whether it worked, and it was only temporary. It was during the time when Russia still owned Citgo. Americans own Citgo now, which is something very recent, last year or so. And so, it's a little bit more weird and problematic for all kinds of reasons. But and crypto, of course, is this really a whole nother kind of thing, but it's going to get mentioned here in the article. To move beyond the conceptual confusion surrounding technofeudalism, it's useful to return to Marx's Capital. Notably absent from most technofeudalist critiques is a serious engagement with Volume 3 of Capital, which is what I've been yammering about for about a year now. Particularly its theory of rent, which is also what I've been yammering about, and looking at various versions of the rent problem, obviously going back to Ricardo and neo-Ricardianism and those things that happen after neo-Ricardianism to work through, how is it that rents and rentier capitalism ultimately, how does that work? And it's not to get a handle on it in the sense that, we're going to make more money, or it's a theoretical problem that others have not caught up with yet. In other words, data, big data has not really quite worked through some of the issues. There's a thing now. Well, anyway, I won't digress too far. But anyway, it's an important area. With few exceptions, scholars have largely overlooked the relevance of this aspect of Marx's work to the analysis of today's digital economy. Now, their digital economy, is problematic in its own way because, of course, information and computer technology, ICT, has been around for a while. And digital economy has been there as long as there's been banks or whatever. So this is not new. Our ability to handle it is probably newer, only because a lot of people need to get a handle on it. Other people are just lazy and still worry about, the penny and a copper in that sense. This theoretical omission has contributed to the tendency to a quite contemporary rent extraction directly with feudalism, bypassing a critical assessment of rent within capitalism itself. So this is a distinguishing characteristic, partially driven by certain types of literature or scholarship that says, well, we're all running around looking for rent, or those who are at least in charge are, trying to get rent and all that stuff. And the question for, Marxists is to say, well, is the rent or isn't the rent, is it surplus value? Does it have profit? And we can split hairs on this business, but most of it is about scale. It is about networks and networking effects and a bunch of other things. And in that sense, it's still, medieval in that context, which goes to say that rents did exist in the feudal period, and the rents exist now, of course, as kind of meta rents or whatever. In this context, the publication of back to the text, publication of Marx's economic manuscripts and notebooks in the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, the MEGA is highly significant. These texts, it's all digital and it's online. I think all of them are online, but you have to plow through Marx's terrible scrawl in some cases. So it's a kind of translation problem for a lot of people. And these are scrawls in German and French and whatever. So there's hard work being done, not by me, but most scholars who are working with Amiga are people who actually get usually the German or English versions of these things, which is fine, but it is a translation problem, and Saito himself is kind of a product of that. Kind of he made his bones, as it were, in the field because of one word either mistranslated or misinterpreted by Marx in some obscure documents that relate to this in the manuscripts. And that it caused a bunch of a minor kerfuffle, academic kerfuffle, and it is a way of the way in which we talk about all of these other things that other Marxists talk about, the metabolic rift and blah blah blah. All of those things have a hinge on those kinds of ideas. That on the one hand, we look at Marx as an inerrant kind of biblical type text. It's not really that. It's incomplete, as we pointed out before, as I pointed out before many times. And so that our own sense of a total or the sense of a whole or even a sense of an ending is always fragmentary, and we're always reconstructing it, and we should be fine with that. It's not the effing Bible. So These texts illuminate the later Marxist theoretical developments in rent theory and offer a crucial foundation for analyzing rentier capitalism, that period that we are currently in, that is primarily a digital economy, but not the economy. The economy is still the economy. It's just that there's a lot of it that gets represented digitally and manipulated digitally that is incredibly problematic because, no one's kind of applying the analysis properly and simply sloughing off any kind of crucial analysis into something else. And while we're doing that, other people, capitalists, oligarchs, authoritarians, are taking advantage of that. Anyway, by extending Marx's framework, this paper argues that rentier capitalism represents the most advanced and possibly final. See, he's addressing this same point that Wark was looking at and that Yarfakis is looking at. Is this the end of capitalism? If it is the final form of capitalism, then hopefully, socialism is beyond the horizon. Well, that's not there yet. And yet you could argue that it could be. I mean, in a certain utopian way, getting rid of currency might do that. But we haven't really gotten rid of currency. And in fact, there are idiots running around who would love us to go back to metal, which is even stupider. But anyway, Marx's theory of rent reveals the destructive tendencies of the system, particularly through its monopolization and predation of the commons. Now, what does that mean? Certain things are being, marked off, demarcated, appropriated. People are putting fences around shit. Some things that are free are not free anymore. You have to subscribe to them or whatever, and that's all part of this. The only people who can determine this are people who are, monopolists who control, and this is overgeneralizing, control the price system, and therefore control the market. That's much more complicated than that. And of course, there are people who work on this price system and act in a predatory way, which is why I've been fiddling around with, antitrust stuff. I'm just learning about it. I have been actually looking at antitrust for many decades, but the way that antitrust operates is always as a kind of a servant of capitalism, of capitalists, of oligarchs. It's always, meant to leverage, corporate power ultimately, in concert with the government, the state, which helps to regulate predation. Now, the fact is, we have very little of that these days, since it's been destroyed or fragmented by certain, fascists. So we can have wonderful scholastic discussions about it, but the reality is, antitrust doesn't do a hell of a lot, and ultimately it's still coming down to not so much the antitrust elements, but the courts themselves, which, of course, interpret the antitrust elements, and a lot of that is just tedious and stupid and whatever, but there is a literature, and it still occurs. Now, of course, it's not to suggest that Marx anticipated the current situation in its entirety, and it didn't. I mean, he wasn't that crazy. But the 19th century did have a lot of utopian thinking. A crucial problem that Marx did not foresee is the profound crisis facing contemporary anti-systemic movements. So, being in an anti-systemic movement, on the one hand, seems kind of good. You seem revolutionary. It's like the Paris Commune or something. But the reality is that it's just, some of it's just reactionary. Some of it's just anti-modern. Some people would like to get us back to the 17th and 18th centuries only because they're idiots. But that's happening. Rentier capitalism, bolstered by new technologies of surveillance and behavioral manipulation, increasingly establishes, hear this word again, total subsumption of life under capital. Subsumption is like, well, you could argue that it's like the Borg. It totally, it is this idea of a kind of assimilative, a kind of presence within an economy or situation, thereby eroding the possibility of anti-capitalist solidarity. See, the point, of course, of all of this is to eradicate opposition, and anti-capitalist opposition has, it's been there for a while, since the 19th century at least, and in a very palpable form because it could bring down whole governments. Less so now, and it's unfortunate, and some people indulge it simply as a kind of utopian fantasy, historical, anachronistic thing. But the reality is, I think we already see the fractures and abilities, and people can transcend this. And we see lots of people trying to get it to move in certain directions. And what we don't have, of course, is solidarity. And that's the issue of anti-capitalist solidarity should be the key element for the next, decade or so, is what counts as anti-capitalist solidarity. And on the one hand, being an anti-capitalist would be to eradicate capitalism. Well, it's not so much eradicating it as it is just moving it farther along. And from a historical materialist point of view, just moving it further because, if regardless of whether you believe it's going to kill itself or not, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, blah, 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 the organic capital, blah, 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 all of that stuff, whether you believe it or not, something like that probably will happen. In other words, as we erase, at least in certain parts of the world, currency, that may signal something. Or from a modern monetary theory, modern money theory, that's also eliminating some of this as well. The fact is they're not all working in concert, and in some cases it acts in a reactionary way. There are anti-government, anti-capitalists who are fascists, who believe that, if I can't control everything, nobody else should control everything. Anyway, in the absence of powerful anti-systemic movements, social, economic, and political instability is likely to intensify in the years ahead, potentially culminating in a shift towards a more authoritarian regime, which is where we are right now. And, Saito, writing as Trump comes into power, this is what he's talking about. And so that's what makes this very current. Now, why the techno-feudal thesis misses the point. And of course, this is kind of a big deal because Saito is obviously taking on people like Varoufakis. He's not really taking on Wark, because Wark is talking in big metaphorical ways, and she has a whole other thing that she's doing. Whereas Varoufakis actually has a social democratic point. He has skin in the game. It comes from being a former finance minister. He thinks he has more of this thing going on, but it's unclear whether he is or isn't, in terms of Europe. And then, of course, the difference with us in the States is it's not quite identical. What's going on. So, reflecting on the decline of left-wing movements amid the rise of the digital economy, the late Mark Fisher famously lamented that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Yeah. Well, I don't know where that gets us. I mean, the meteor, what's it, a 1 out of 2,700 chance of getting hit by an asteroid. Which is not the best odds. I mean, and fortunately, things will change before that asteroid gets here. But those are the kind of odds I don't like personally. But we'll do something about it. We either have technology to push the asteroid out of the way, or whatever, deflect it or break it up or whatever. There's a whole literature for that. Yet today, one might be tempted to argue that digitalization has, in fact, brought about the end of capitalism. Well, yeah, that's a claim and not a good argument. This end, however, differs significantly from what Fisher had in mind, and even more so what Karl Marx envisioned some 150 years ago. Well, of course it does. Capitalism has not been overthrown by the working class in a progressive historical transition towards socialism. As much as we would love to have that happen, it just didn't happen. Some people pretended that it happened, that caused all kinds of trouble. See the Soviet Union, driven by the development of productive forces, locomotives and tractors and blah, blah, blah. On the contrary, history now appears to be moving backwards from capitalism to feudalism. Well, that's controversial if you kind of believe that historical materialism kind of works, and you don't go backwards in historical materialism. You can do things that make it appear like you're going backwards, but it's only appearances. It's not, I mean, it's, well, anyway, it's teleologically impossible. But needless to say, according to this interpretation, certain recent rapid technological advances in the digital sphere have led capital to kill capitalism itself, ushering in an era of technofeudalism. Well, that'll sell books, but and gets you invited to yak at events and blah blah blah. If you're still a careerist, but whether it has any real force is a whole different question. Anyway, why is feudalism reemerging in the digital age? At the core of this argument is the claim that today's digital economy is driven less by the production of goods at surplus value and more by competition for monopolistic rent. It's driven by both, and monopolistic rent is only a characterization you might make about goods and surplus value. That's all. You can't sort of bifurcate this. Rent extraction has become a dominant and predatory economic practice. That's true, diverging significantly from the foundational logic of capitalist production, which centers on the exploitation of labor to generate surplus value. But it hasn't changed the underlying, Marxian position of, yes, stuff gets produced, stuff gets circulated, and what we argue about are the larger distributional questions. So in this new paradigm, so just to follow this argument, in this new paradigm, users of digital platforms are described as quote unquote cloud serfs who, rather than cultivating land and paying ground rent to the landlords, cultivate digital platforms through the production of data, effectively paying those of us who have, Patreon accounts, I guess, paying digital rent to access goods and services offered by cloud thieves. Yeah, but I don't know what that gets us. I mean, we know that it operates and it has a certain amount of power, but to organize it politically is, well nigh impossible when it can be manipulated in really horrible ways. My favorite example being GoFundMe, where people literally can hit the jackpot because they're victims or whatever. Through the monopolization of vast digital platforms, cloudalists have constructed a space in which the defining features of capitalism, such as the quote-unquote free market, competition, profit, and exploitation. Now, this is a problematic claim, are increasingly supplanted by feudal characteristics, including monopoly. Yes, monopoly operated in the feudal context. Appropriation, yes, appropriation existed then too, and rent. Now, the point is, these have feudal characteristics, but, you can argue for the free market operating within the context of the barter system and market, stuff in the Middle Ages, blah, blah, blah. You can operate on with competition models. Certainly, if you think about how religion in the Western European context operated, because it was competitive. Needless to say, Adnan has talked about that literally from the other side, that is the Jewish Islamic sort of side. All that's competitive. It's not, it's not monopoly. It's oligopoly in that sense. And profit and exploitation existed. It just existed in different ways. Surpluses were developed, or wealth was developed in a different way in the Middle Ages, but it's not that different from the current day. Every activity, that's my little editorial on that. Every activity within this space is meticulously planned, manipulated, and coordinated by algorithms designed to maximize the profits of platform owners. Well, it does do that if you're a platform owner, perhaps, but there is, something larger. There are industries or groupings of platform owners that make that problematic. On the other hand, there are oligopolists. There are people who have taken their little positions to do more feudal kinds of things. That is, people are convincing other rich people to go up and spend, a small amount of time in space so that they can claim they were astronauts, that kind of bullshit. So even Thiel, co-founder of PayPal, same guy who believes the Antichrist is coming, even though he may be the Antichrist, acknowledges the neo-feudal nature of contemporary tech companies from an entrepreneurial perspective. The companies, quote, the companies that create new technology often resemble feudal monarchies rather than organizations that are supposedly more, quote unquote, modern. Well, that's a sort of a non sequitur in the sense that the resemblance to feudal monarchies only comes because certain parties, it is an agency structure question, they're not any more feudal. They just happen to be monopolists. That's all, or oligopolists, and then they or monopsonists. They control stuff, which is no different on the one hand than the Middle Ages. But it doesn't mean that we're in the Middle Ages. It just means that a certain thing that occurs actually in the modern period is just happening. Given this, what, if anything, is problematic about the popular re-feudalization thesis? So it's just kind of a straw argument because it's hard to, as you can tell from my yammering here, it's hard to tell whether there's actually re-feudalization going on. Something is going on. Higher concentration is going on. Appropriation is going on. Rent seeking is certainly going on. Whether it's being re-feudalized is, it'll sell books, I suppose. Morozov has already criticized technofeudalism as an inadequate concept. Yes, I'm fall on that side, arguing that major tech companies are actively engaged in fierce competition to maximize profits through the production of new commodities such as, yes, index search services, yes, Google, etc. And of course, there's the antitrust thing that hasn't gotten hold of Google yet. Is trying, but it's probably not going to succeed for all the usual reasons. And novel entertainment experiences, Spotify, Netflix, which does have a churning to it because it's it's much more fluid, but it is competitive in that sense, as well as through substantial investments in data centers, cloud infrastructure, artificial intelligence, blah, blah, blah. This dynamic competition, driven by the logic of profit maximization, it's always been driven by the logic of profit maximization, stands in stark contrast to the static image of feudal society. It's just that. It is anachronistic to even bring up feudal relations, even though, yes, everyone's workplace is kind of operates in a kind of feudal way. They're, people have mentors, mentees, there's, grooming, there's there's all kinds of exploitation, sexual and otherwise. That it's feudal society. Sure, fine. But whether it's going to get us to feudalism is a whole different question. Now, it could get us to chaos, which is kind of what's going on. According to Morozov, technofeudalism is often deployed as a moral critique of tech oligarchs by portraying them as lazy rentiers profiting through monopolies without engaging in productive labor. Now, this characterization is problematic at the get-go because critiquing rentiers in the 19th century context is certainly appropriate. There was a ruling class. A lot of people, landed property owners, royalty, a bunch of those folks in the British context are running around and, being lazy. They're being, they're doing what they think is productive, but it's not productive at all. In fact, it's just simply getting them into trouble. And that's kind of, and I go back and refer to, Downton Abbey is that kind of thing. You can see, oh, well, they actually are lazy. They work really hard and they hate each other and blah, blah, blah. But, they're kind of not doing anything. And part of the whole narrative of Downton Abbey is a modernist one. What happens when times change and crisis changes and how are things altered? And that's the kind of the whole story. You have to divide up your land. You have people marrying people you shouldn't, out of your class and blah, blah, blah. All that's there. The more urgent theoretical task, he contends, is to critically examine the actual economic structures of the contemporary digital economy. So defining that and getting all that kind of worked out is part of the current problem, particularly from an economic point of view. In fact, by failing to expose the internal contradictions of digital capitalism, not unlike non-digital or analog capitalism, the neo-feudalism thesis risks implying that capitalism could be made more progressive simply by resisting a supposed return to feudalism. So what you see is kind of an anti-modern kind of tendency with a kind of neoliberal kind of tendency. So, oh, well, we could just argue against this, a trope about feudalism, and we can, reform neoliberal capitalism. Well, I think that's failed, but whatever. There are people who still write books and get careers and do shit like that. Zuboff and Mazzucato advocate for a fairer and more competitive form of digital capitalism to be achieved by dismantling and regulating illegitimate monopolies held by big tech firms. That's a kind of antitrust approach to it, one that presumes that that competitiveness has a kind of shape to it, when in fact it's irregular and problematic, and for all the reasons we study more closely competitive models in the classical political economy sense. Yet, back to the text, yet such faith in a more benign digital capitalism may be overly optimistic. Consider Apple. Zuboff's preferred model, which has been criticized for its monopolistic pricing strategy, soft shoring of labor, violation of privacy regulations, systematic tax avoidance, and lack of environmental responsibility. Yeah, that's a ton of criticism. According to Morozov, such inadequate interpretations of the contemporary economy stem from an overly dualistic conception of capitalism. Well, that's the problem of all dichotomous arguments. So, that's kind of a tautology. But anyway, for Varoufakis, capitalism is defined by market exchange, with accumulation occurring through the exploitation of surplus labor, whereas feudalism is characterized by monopoly and the appropriation of surplus labor. You see, the point is, and this is the key point that I've been doing in some of this reading, is the difference between this characterization of exploitation versus appropriation. And I can't remember which thing I was reading that talked about this as a key difference, but yes, it is a key difference. The difference between an appropriative move and an exploitative move. Appropriation seems more active, well, however you want to look at the semantics of it, and exploitation seems a little bit more like the lazy rentier imagination. People are just parasitically sitting around. That's I would assert a false dichotomy, because both things are going on simultaneously or concurrently. However, this binary opposition between market and monopoly, now the fact is, monopolies need markets. There's a whole thing that does not easily bifurcate this. Economy and politics, exploitation and appropriation offers too narrow a framework. Yes, it does. I agree with Saito here, for understanding the capitalist mode of production. In reality, capitalist development has always involved forms of appropriation alongside the exploitation of labor. Indeed, it does, because it's always uneven. It's always asymmetric. Whatever. Appropriation includes unequal exchange between the periphery and the imperial core. That's Wallerstein, right? That's world system theory, development theory since the post-war period. That is post-World War II period. And yes, there are periphery correlations, and yes, they exist at a global scale, and yes, it's a big network problem, and blah blah blah. Reproductive labor, predominantly performed by women, Federici, 2004, and the appropriation of nature's unpaid contributions. This is, sort of Jason Moore on the web of life and blah, blah, blah. That's a whole nother thing. We don't want to go at the current moment. But it is problematic because, he often defends it from kind of a very difficult point of view. Or it's not so much difficult. He has straw men that he kind of attacks that, oh, well, that's too Kantian or whatever, and doesn't really get anywhere with it. But that's just me. The presence of widespread appropriation in the digital economy, therefore, does not in itself justify the current reclass. This is the straw argument again. Does not in itself justify reclassifying the current system as feudal. Morozov's critique of technofeudalism is largely convincing. So, Saito's hedging his bets here, but that I would probably fall on that side as well. However, he does not offer a capitalist theory of value that coherently integrates the dynamics of both exploitation and appropriation. And I think that that's the coherent integration of the dynamics of both exploitation and appropriation. Because, in fact, exploitation and appropriation is a kind of structure agency argument and needs to be, built out a little bit more. Instead, he turns to Nancy Fraser's framework as an alternative. Yet, Fraser not only highlights the need for a multi-stranded critique. Now, this is where it gets problematic, of course, because the whole idea of this multi-stranded thing gets us into intersectionality, all the things that the fascists want to kill, DEI, blah, blah, blah. One that addresses class, ecology, the state, and gender. But they all operate that way. I mean, it's operative now. Why would we worry about pedophiles in the government if it weren't for that? Why is it? Well, anyway, as a result, the explanatory potential of Marxian economic theory remains underdeveloped in relation to the emerging digital economy. Yes, it is. That's where I also agree. Morozov ultimately fails to analyze the expansion of digital appropriation through the lens of Marx's labor theory of value. Much like Varoufakis conflates digital capitalism with technofeudalism, Morozov blurs the historic specificity of today's digital capitalism by failing to differentiate between distinct forms of appropriation within the capitalist system. Now, I'm going to begin to stop here and go to the conclusion because I've already done all this. I've yammered about this point by point in my little video. So let's skip to the conclusion. However, the total subsumption of life under digital capital is not absolute. In that sense, it's, relative, relational, all that sort of stuff. It is not only anti-systemic resistance that finds itself in profound crisis, that, anybody who paid attention to the democratic socialists can see that. As the preceding analysis has shown, the broader prospects for economic growth, because we do need to have economic growth, even if you believe in steady state economies and whatever growth still occurs, are also diminishing under rentier capitalism. And yes, that is, but it's not parasitic relations necessarily, but it is, a kind of, to use econophysics language, there's a kind of inertial problem, a gravitational problem that might exist in that context. That's why some of us spend time looking at that. The survival strategies of capitalism as a system premised on infinite accumulation are increasingly exhausted, leaving only the path of systemic robbery and plunder. We just had a perfect example of that in terms of oil profits in Venezuela. Even if the transition to rentier capitalism is realized, the new regime of appropriation cannot replicate the conditions of stable social integration once made possible by the Fordist regime of accumulation, which was anchored in economic growth and full employment. You haven't heard the word jobs anywhere in all of this Trumpian BS. And in fact, ideologically speaking, people need to sort of say, well, okay, all this, is interesting, but what actually happens down in the trenches, down in income and wage level stuff? What is it that, and we haven't got a lot of reporting what's happening on the ground. I know that there's a lot of repression going on, but, in Venezuela, for example. Instead, because the source of profit in rentier capitalism lies in the continual enclosure and dispossession of the commons, that's the terrain of conflict is, one of these kinds of commons. That is, the commons, economic, political, and social instability is bound to deepen. It is. It's currently going on right now. We just haven't seen it fully manifest because we haven't, spring hasn't happened yet. Once spring happens, we're going to see stuff's going to happen. Churning is happening. What's going on in Iran now will be a lot worse in 6 months, or it'll be different. Let's put it that way. The future of capitalism under this regime points not towards renewal, but toward escalating crises. And that's where we are. In this context, the growing reliance on authoritarianism to preserve order is less a sign of strength than an expression of the system's structural fragility. It is structurally fragile to have idiots run around saying, oh, well, we'll just move all the Palestinians out and just rebuild it, and they can come back in and pay rent. That's just not going to happen. I mean, they don't even think they don't even want that to happen. But, there's this weirdness that shows that people are really not thinking about what's going on. How the double crisis of capitalist accumulation of an anti-systemic movements will evolve remains uncertain. Sure. Confronting this impasse demands first and foremost a clear recognition of the transformation under rentier capitalism without retreating into techno-feudalist frameworks. And yeah, because I think it's self-limiting, it doesn't get you anywhere. It's a language problem. I mean, it's okay, but storming the Bezos castle is not kind of what we're supposed to do. I mean, I think there are other things that can be done, but it's not, storming the Bezos castle doesn't really get you anything. Capital remains an indispensable resource for understanding both the historical trajectory of capitalism and the intensifying logic of total subsumption. There's a lot packed in one sentence, but there's an intensifying logic of total subsumption going on. And yet, imagining a post-capitalist future in the digital age requires going beyond Marx's original vision, but that's always been the case. Our task today is to deepen the critical analysis of economic, social, and political destabilization by engaging with Marx's theoretical tools. So, the easy thing to look at is the fact that exploitation is going on. Appropriation certainly is going on, and you could see that just, the Venezuela thing really shows that, demonstrates that probably pretty obviously, and shows, all of the flaws in current activity or actions that are obviously, clearly authoritarian, clearly stupid because they didn't have even planned out what they were going to do. They're motivated by a whole bunch of other kind of badly conceived bourgeois beliefs about peace, economy, property, even, and has all the contradictions built into it. A thorough reappraisal of this largely neglected theory of rent is a necessary starting point for this endeavor. Okay, I got to the end. Hooray! I yammered about on the other matters. Earlier on, I went over by 15 minutes. I'm going to stop now by going back to the meeting and